All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 4, Section 3, An Empire of Slavery and the Consumer Revolution. So an important point about English slavery, especially in this colonial period, was that it was practiced in all of the colonies. Now, it was much more prevalent and influential in some than others. So, for example, if we were to say, which colonies relied the most upon African slavery and were the most shaped by it, we might say, certainly the colonies of the Caribbean first. Places like Jamaica and Barbados had the highest ratio of enslaved Africans to free white inhabitants. Then we might move to the mainland of North America and look towards South Carolina. We might then move to the Chesapeake, which in fact was where probably the largest number of enslaved people worked in the colonial era on those tobacco plantations. But then moving up, and of course the sort of least influential area was New England. And influential, I mean, the area in which African slavery, the slave system of economics, politics, society, and culture had probably the least amount of influence. But that's not to say that there weren't slaves there. In the colonial era, there were enslaved people in Pennsylvania, in New York, especially New York City, a very high concentration of African slaves there due to some of the remnants from when the Dutch controlled the slave trade, even in places like Boston. And, slavery in the colonies was not just purely based off economics, but it was also influenced by law, politics. Think about things like the slave codes, which very much put enshrined into law this system. It also affected society in the way that, we might say the racial caste or the racial caste system in which society was organized, especially in these colonies here, off of race, off of skin color. Your place in society was determined by that, and even culture. And this was true even in areas like the North, where certainly a culture of white supremacy was, only embraced by this system of slavery. So again, prevalent in all the colonies, but to different degrees, right? Shaping much more some of these, on this end of the spectrum, where it was much more prevalent. Now, slavery in the English colonies only continued to grow through the reign of Charles II and James I. In fact, this coin here depicts James II, King of England. It is made from gold. Gold was one of those commodities that was acquired from Africa. Africa had a lot of gold to offer. And the English company, the Royal African Company, had a monopoly on the African slave trade. If you don't really recall what a monopoly is, it pretty much means that there's no competition. So during the reign of Charles II and James I, this was the only English company that could legally do business in the slave trade in Africa. However, that monopoly ended in 1689 with the Glorious Revolution. And the consequence of that, right? The consequence of that was that this only accelerated the slave trade. Think of it this way. Before, there was only one company that was allowed to trade. When that ended, more English companies were legally able to engage in the slave trade. And so more and more and more slaves were brought from Africa to the English colonies in the Americas. The voyage from Africa, this is a good term to note. We talked about this in a previous chapter. The voyage from Africa to the New World is referred to as the Middle Passage. We will call this the brutal voyage from Africa to the New World. It was a death trap. Anywhere from approximately 20% of the people died on that voyage. So if one was even lucky enough to survive that voyage, the hellish conditions of slavery itself only awaited one after the Middle Passage was over. Most slaves from Africa arrived in the Caribbean in terms of the number, but increasingly more and more made their way to some of the English colonies in North America. Somewhere like 5% of all slaves that went across the Middle Passage ended up into North America, the English colonies there. Life as a slave, as you might imagine, was very difficult, very tough. It meant resistance at pretty much every single point. Slaves resisted in a number of different ways, sabotaging the plantation owners' economic prospects, breaking tools on purpose and claiming it was an accident, letting animals roam free. One of the most effective forms of resistance in the English colonies of North America was running away. Right, we might say that running away equals most effective. And sometimes resistance took the form of violence, to rise up and liberate oneself. One good example of this was the Stono Rebellion. This was one of we might call this the bloodiest slave revolt in the North American NA, English colonies. It happened in South Carolina. Ultimately, the participants of the Stono Rebellion, it's believed that they had been exposed, or the Portuguese had converted a large number of them to Catholicism, or at least made them familiar with Catholicism. This was one way or one avenue in which the slaves could band together and rise up against their English owners. Ultimately, the Stono Rebellion did fail, much like many violent rebellions in North America, or at least in English North America, and there are some reasons for that. Ultimately, the result of violent rebellions like Stono and like others was stricter laws. And stricter laws could be something like, the prohibition of gatherings of a certain number of slaves. It could be things like literacy. And typically that's what you see in at least the context of rebellions in the English colonies. And even to a certain degree, following the American Revolution, even rebellions or revolts when it comes to the United States. So maybe we'll just kind of take a side note here and, ask this question, why were violent slave revolts, or maybe why were slave revolts not common? Well, there's a couple of things to consider here. One is demographics. And that is in pretty much every single English colony, the free white inhabitants outnumbered the enslaved African inhabitants. So in any sort of violent uprising, numbers would not be on the side of slaves. One we also might consider is geography. Right? The geography of the English colonies of North America, at least, is very spread out. Slaves are much more spread out than places like the Caribbean. And another point to make about demographics here, because you can compare, for example, the English colonies of North America with some of the Caribbean islands. When you look at a place like Jamaica, Barbados, Haiti, and France, violent revolts are much more common there. And that's typically because slaves outnumber the free white population 20-1, 25-1, et cetera, et cetera. So, we could point to things like demographics and geography and say that, well, violent revolt was a little bit less common in the English colonies of North America as compared to some of the sugar colonies in, in the Caribbean or in Barbados. And it was simply because of the geography that, for example, running away was, a better alternative. And maybe we might put that as maybe probably the most important reason was that simply there were better alternatives, right? And by better alternatives, we mean to run away. A lot more spread out space for people to scroll down a little bit. A lot more space for people to, to get away and escape or evade any type of capture. So incidents like the Stono Rebellion, put slave owners and just in general white citizens on edge. The consequence of the Stono Rebellion eventually even spilled into New York with the New York conspiracy trials of 1741. That was a rumor that a slave revolt was being inspired, or at least in part inspired, by Catholic missionaries. So we might just say, the connection here was that, Catholic priests were conspiring with slaves to revolt. These trials are probably more important than the other more publicized trials in the history of the English colonies, and that is the Salem witch trials. These may be more historically important. The conspiracy got out of hand when, or the conspiracy trials got underway when fires broke out in New York City. Using fires to start a revolt is sort of a typical tactic. And even though there's very little evidence to suggest that there was even a conspiracy to begin with, a number of people were killed, including African slaves who were burned at the stake for their presumed role in this conspiracy, and a number of Spanish Catholic missionaries who were accused of having conspired it. So we might say of the New York conspiracy trials in 1741, a number of people were killed. And in both these cases, the Stono Rebellion and the conspiracy trials of 1741, both of these show the type of fear that these sort of violent insurrections could place in the hearts of those who supported and continue to perpetuate the system of African slavery in the English colonies, both north and south. Another important point here at the very end of this chapter, not really much to say about it, but we do want to touch upon it, and that is the consumer revolution and the emergence of a consumer class. The gentry is the emergence of a colonial consumer class. We might say gentry. They're sort of like an elite colonial consumer class. That means they buy stuff, right? And they try to copy pretty much the royalty and nobility of England. Now, these are not royalty or noble individuals. That's one thing that really sets the United States apart from a lot of their European counterparts, is there's no really long tradition or history of like royalty and royal bloodlines. But these individuals who made their money in the New World, typically owning slaves on plantations, tried to copy the royalty of Europe by buying huge houses, fancy furniture, sort of all these other consumer products. However, though, this consumer revolution, which is simply just a growth in purchasing, but maybe we'll be more specific, purchasing items from we'll just say purchasing items globally. That's probably a better way of putting it. And that is to say that, these are items that are not being produced in the colonies and consumed by the colonies. These might be items that are purchased in India, travel to Great Britain, then arrive in the colonial world, or a commodity that comes from Africa, goes to Europe, and then comes back to the colonial world. So it really begins to connect the colonies with England. We might say a tighter connection or a closer connection between colonies and the world, right? This growth of consumption kind of brings the world together. A good example is tea. Tea was something that became a British staple, not just in England, but also in the colonial world. It became part of the culture. Tea doesn't grow in England. It doesn't grow in the North American colonies. It was, obtained in places like India, where the English Empire spread, and also printed materials. And that is to say, there's some examples that your textbook gives. Cato's Letters, Mr. Spectator, Robinson Crusoe were some of the popular ones. But that is to say, there was some sort of shared English culture that people in the New World or the English colonies of North America were drinking their tea and reading their Robinson Crusoe. And similarly, there were people in England who were sipping their tea and reading their Robinson Crusoe. So it's kind of this sort of shared Anglo culture that connected or that bridged really the Atlantic Ocean through this consumer revolution.